The painting behind me is from middle of the 19th century, about 1854 or so. It was painted by a man named William Holman Hunt. And it comes from the passage that Lynn read for us in Revelation 3 just a few minutes ago. It's Jesus as Lord, King, standing at the door and knocking. I know it's on a screen, we're kind of far away, so it's kind of hard to see some detail. So let's zoom in on the top for just a second. And I want to show you, or just maybe call to your attention, a couple of things in this. First from the top and then from the bottom. What you'll see at the top of Jesus' head is a crown. And so Mr. Hunt, as he painted this, as he envisions the scene in Revelation chapter 3, he clearly sees Jesus as ruler, as king, as someone, as a master, someone who has authority over things. He's got a crown. That's what kings and rulers wear. His clothes point out the same thing. If you see around his cloak, he's got precious stones and jewels. He is not, in this scene, a poor, wayfaring stranger or anything like that. He's a master. He's a ruler. He's at a door, you can see here on the left side of the screen. And if we look at the bottom of the screen there, you see some plants rising up. If you zoom in on the bottom half of this picture, you see that those plants aren't supposed to be there. This is not a finely tuned, well-organized garden. This is a painter that, as Mr. Hunt paints it anyway, this is a painting of a door that Jesus is knocking on, and these are weeds that are growing up. These are vines that are growing up. And so we are left with the implication that this door hasn't been open for a while. We hadn't talked about what the door is just yet, but this is a door that has not been touched in some time. At least it has not been opened, and nobody has entered through this door, maybe even come out of this door, in a pretty long while. The vines have overtaken this door. Can we zoom out on the picture one more time, Michael? And so we've got the plants at the bottom that are weeds. We've got Jesus wearing his crown and his precious stones and jewels in his cloak. He's carrying this light. The painting is called the light of the world. And he's knocking on a door that hasn't been opened in some time. Now, we are left to imagine from Revelation chapter 3, this image that we get in verses 20 to 22. We're kind of left to imagine what's going on in this scene. Now, this is William Holman Hunt's rendition of it. It's classic. It's probably the most well-known painting of that period of Jesus. But I'm not going to tell you today that his version is right or his interpretation of the story is the only interpretation. But what I'd like for us to think about is, what is that door? Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if you will open the door, then I will come in and I'll be with you, and we will eat together. We'll have supper together, is what Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3. But what is the door? There are lots of interpretations on that door. And I'll tell you, this is William Holman Hunt's interpretation. He said the door in that painting, it has no handle and can therefore be opened only from the inside. And he says this door represents the obstinately shut mind. It has no handle on the outside. It cannot be opened from the outside. And for the painter of the piece, he says it represents the obstinately shut mind. That's pretty good. I can get along with that. But then I still have another question. What mind are we talking about? Is it the world's mind? That's an easy interpretation. That would be really easy for us if we could say, well, it's the world that will not open their doors to the Lord Jesus as king, as ruler, as he stands outside. They will keep the door shut. Is it an unbeliever's door? That's another very common interpretation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Is it an unbeliever's door that is shut to Jesus and they will not allow him into their house or anything like that? Is it something else? Is it those who are maybe rejecting Jesus outright? No ifs, ands, buts about it. They are rejecting Jesus. They don't like anything about Jesus. They are slamming the door shut in his face. Is that what the door is about? Is that the obstinately shut mind in the piece? Is it our door? That's one we don't like. We don't want to think about that one. Our door, plural, as a church. Our door, singular, as a Christian? Surely not. Surely not. It's not us. Couldn't be us. It's got to be them. It's got to be the world or the unbeliever or those who are outrightly rejecting Jesus. It can't be us. Cannot be us. Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll figure that out along the way. But the door is shut in the painting. And there is no handle on the outside of the door. There's no doorknob in the painting. There are weeds. There's no doorknob. And that's kind of what Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3. The door is shut in Revelation chapter 3, but if you read the chapter, the doors are not the only things that are closed off. Can we read the passage together? Revelation chapter 3. Lynn started in verse 20 because I told him I don't want him to be the bad guy. I'll read the tough part. Verse 14, the angel of the church in Laodicea. So, hey, look, first thing we ought to notice is that this is a letter that is written to a church. And so we probably ought to think about ourselves and our interpretations if our first thought is to think about, well, that door must be the unbeliever's door. Or that door must be the world's door. They are not letting Jesus in. That's a hard sell when we put two and two together and figure out that this is a letter from the Lord to the church. Not a letter from the Lord to people who don't believe in him or people who are outright rejecting him. It's not to the world. It's to the church at Laodicea. To that church in Laodicea, write the words of the Amen, the faithful, the true witness, the beginning of God's creation. We ought to not miss this. All right? Jesus does not present himself as I said earlier, a poor, wayfaring stranger, a beggar, or anything like that. He's the creator God. Powerful, authority, master, ruler. Those are the words that should be coming to our minds when we read this letter. This is the word of the master, the ruler, the king of the universe to his church. Not unbelievers, not the world, not people rejecting him outright with their actions and words, to the church. Here's what he says right to him. I know your works. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm, not cold, not hot, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I'm rich, I've prospered, I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Well, none of those are compliments, okay? You think you're this, Jesus says, but I'm telling you that it couldn't be farther from the truth. We'll talk more about that. And so, verse 18, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you can be rich, white garments, so that you can clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline, so be zealous and repent. Hey, we're going to come back to this in a minute, but in case I forget, I do want you to know that as harsh of a tone as this letter has, and as much rebuking is found in this letter, Jesus says, I love you. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. So I want you to turn from your ways, all right? So this is whatever we find in this letter is out of Jesus' love for us. But behold, I stand at the door and I knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. The one who conquers, I'll grant to sit with me on my throne. Again, ruler, already on a throne. As I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The door's shut. There is no handle. There's no knob. Jesus stands at the door and knocks. And the first thing we got to cut through in this letter is not really the weeds that are growing up in front of the door. The first thing we got to cut through in the letter are some misconceptions that you and I may bring to our interpretation of Revelation chapter 3. One of them concerns the idea of lukewarm. I wish that you were hot, or I wish that you were cold, but you are not hot, you're not cold, you are lukewarm, and I will spit you, spew you, vomit you, whatever the translation is. You'll be out of my mouth. Well, common thought about lukewarmness kind of comes from the words of Jesus. You're not hot, you're not cold. And in our day, in late 20th century, early 21st century that we live in, hot is something we talk about when we are on fire for Jesus. And I think this may have grown out of stuff in the late 80s, early 90s in Christianity. But that's kind of where the interpretation of you're not hot, you're not cold. Hot is on fire. We are burning with desire. We are fervently burning up for God, and so that's a good thing. And cold then must be on the other side. Cold is I couldn't care less. Cold in a common interpretation is there's no fire within me. I'm just kind of not doing anything. I'm cold. And so if that's true, then we have to interpret Jesus as saying, I wish that you were on fire for me, or I wish that you were as cold as you could be. And I cannot fathom any time that Jesus would have told anybody, I wish that you were dead to me. If this is the case, this is the only case that I can think of in Scripture where Jesus would say, I wish that you were dead to me. And so I don't think that's what he's saying. That's an interpretation. It may or not be a valid interpretation. I think that it is invalid. Not hot, not cold is not the way that it was interpreted for 1,900 years. This idea that we may have of lukewarm is apathy or indifference or just mediocre Christianity. That's relatively new in the grand scheme of Christianity over the last couple thousand years. Now, I will tell you, it makes for some really, really effective sermons. If I can say you got to put yourself on the spectrum, you were either hot or you were cold or you're somewhere in the middle, and Jesus doesn't want you anywhere but on the outer ends of that, and you got to recognize if you're hot or cold. That can make some really, really effective, challenging, moving sermons out of a misinterpretation of Scripture. I don't want to make a sermon out of a misinterpretation. So I'm going to attempt to do better than that. The second interpretation, maybe misconception that we have is the Jesus knocking one. We hit on it a little bit, but the common thought is that Jesus is knocking on the door of an unbeliever's heart. Will you let him in? He's knocking on the door, and he just wants to know you, and you're an unbeliever right now, and he just wants you to welcome him in. And again, look, that can make for some really compelling and challenging invitations and sermons from something like that. That's not what Jesus says. That is not what's happening in Revelation chapter 3. I don't think we read about any of the world or any of the unbelievers in Revelation chapter 3. It's a letter that's written to Christians, not unbelievers. So what do we do? What do we do with Revelation chapter 3, a stern letter written out of love with some misconceptions about it? What do we do with it? Well, we got to figure out what's going on, and so the only way we can do that is to look at the context and figure out what's happening in this letter. And the first place you got to start is, who's it written to? Well, the first place you got to start is, what kind of literature are we reading? These are letters. These are letters written to churches. There are 7 of them. We're on number 7 of them this morning. 7 churches in the ancient world, and in each of those churches, Babylon, the world, the empire, is encroaching in the church. And so these churches are in danger of bringing worldly values and concerns and ways of doing things into the church. The second thing I would tell you about these letters is they are written to churches that probably look a lot like churches today. Maybe our congregation today. These letters are not addressing unbelievers or the world. They are addressing Christians who can give in and acquiesce and compromise and accommodate the world. That's what these letters are. It's written to a bunch of churches with Christians who can become lukewarm. And it's written to a bunch of Christians and churches who can keep Jesus outside the door with no knob to open up and let him in. All right? That's what the letters are. Let me tell you about the city of Laodicea. You may know a little bit about this. You can gather some of this just from reading the letter. But this is a city that is affluent. This is a city that is prosperous. They've got resources. They've made some incredible medical advances in their day. They have cultivated a particular type of sheep that has black wool. It's a banking center of the day. And so the Laodiceans, not the church, the city of Laodicea, the citizens feel very self-sufficient. They don't need anybody from the outside world to bring them money. They got it. They don't need fine clothing from somewhere else. They don't need medical advancements from anywhere else. They create their own medical advancements, and so they're self-sufficient. They're comfortable. There's a little bit of pride in that if we're really looking. In fact, in 60 A.D., a few years before this letter was written, in 60 A.D., the city was destroyed by an earthquake. Rome, the empire, offered help, financial help, material help to help them rebuild, and Laodicea refused it and said, we don't need your help. We can take care of it ourselves. And so you can imagine the kinds of attitudes among the citizens in a city like that. Arrogant, we're all good, we don't need anything else, we don't need anybody else. We can make it on our own. That's the city. And what you got in the church in Laodicea is what happens when the city mindsets encroach upon the church, when attitudes of self-sufficiency spill over into the church of Laodicea and us today. Is it possible to think that we've got it all, that we have all that we need, and as long as we're looking good and we think we got it all figured out, we're good with God? It's possible to think that, sure. But I think what Jesus is saying in Revelation 3 is that we can look like that and feel like that and still miss the mark, and in his language, really be utterly useless for the kingdom work today. Here's what's happening when he talks about lukewarm in Revelation 3:15 and 16. Little geography, in Laodicea, you had a banking center, and you had a medical school, and you had people who focused on eye medicine in Laodicea, and you had particular breeds of sheep that were, foreign to most of the world, and so you had a lot of great things there. What you did not have was water. There's no spring in Laodicea. There are no streams in Laodicea. There's no place for you to just go get the water that you need to drink and bathe. If you thought hot water had healing properties, you don't have anywhere to go get hot water. If you needed some cool, refreshing water, you had nowhere to go to get cool, refreshing water in Laodicea without a little bit of outside help. Well, you had up top a little bit, Hierapolis was another city, and Hierapolis has hot springs. And people would go to Hierapolis in order to sit in the hot springs or have the water of the hot springs around them, and they thought there was a healing component there. And so you could go there. It's about 5 miles away. And then over in Colossae, you had some cold water. You had a river there, Lycus River, that would bring cold water in. And cold water was thought to be very refreshing. It is refreshing on a hot day, and they would have some hot days. And so at Hierapolis, you had the hot springs. At Colossae, you had the cold water. And at Laodicea, you had funneled in water from both places. Aqueducts, common in the Roman Empire, would bring the hot spring water from Hierapolis down to Laodicea, the cold water from the river in Colossae up to Laodicea. But after it's traveled 5 miles from the hot springs and 11 miles from the cold river, the water's not hot anymore. And the water's not cold and refreshing anymore. It's what you would call lukewarm. And the hot water was good for some things, and the cold water was good for some things, but when it's traveled in the aqueduct system for several miles and it's become just room temperature water, then it's not really good for anything. The city that had it all didn't have a source for the one thing that we all need to survive. They had no water. And Jesus plays on that in this letter. His words are actually a gut punch to them. He says, you say in verse 17, I am rich, I've prospered, I need nothing. That's the theme of the day in Laodicea, both in the city and the church. You say, we're rich, we got a lot of stuff, we got a lot of material resources, we don't need anything. But Jesus says, I know your works. And I know even though you say that, you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. The church services were going on decently and in order. They thought we're sufficient. What we've done is sufficient. We feel pretty good about what we've done. We don't really have need for anything else. But like water, they did not have the one thing they needed. Jesus wasn't there. He was on the outside. He wasn't invited in. The door was shut, Jesus on the outside, and they did not even know it yet. Common thought, Jesus knocking at the door of an unbeliever's heart misses it in a couple of ways. Number one, we've already said this is a letter not written to the world, not written to unbelievers. This is a letter written to a group of Christians, a church. And number two, the most common trope, I think, in the teachings of Jesus is not him going to somebody else's house. The most common way Jesus winds up at a house, whether in his life or in his parables, is that a master shows up at his own house. For instance, in Matthew chapter 25, you will read a parable about the talents. And in Matthew 25, you read about a master who's going away, master, ruler, right? We should be thinking about Jesus with a crown on his head, knocking at the door at this point. But you read about a master who seems to be very wealthy and powerful, has authority, and he's going away, and he entrusts whatever he has to his servants. Some get 5 talents, one gets 2, one gets 1 talent. And their job is to do what they can with the master's talents while he is away, while the ruler is gone. They are to do what they are supposed to do. And then in Matthew 25, the master shows back up, not at somebody else's house, not at an unbeliever's house. He's not at the world's house. The master shows back up in Matthew 25 at his house. And the master has come to his house to figure out what his servants have been doing while he has been gone. That's the common theme. In fact, I'd like for us to read a little bit in Luke chapter 12 because you're going to see the exact same original phrasing in Luke chapter 12 that you read about in Revelation chapter 3. Not a coincidence here. Luke 12:35. We're not going to read this entire passage, but he says, "Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast." We got all these same themes in Revelation chapter 3. I want to come in, I want to eat with you, right? Waiting for the master to come home from the wedding feast so that they, the servants, may open the door. Whose door? It's the master's door. It's his house. He's come back home. He's not gone to the world's house, the unbeliever's house. He's come back to his house, all right? When he comes home, open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Now that we know how Jesus commonly uses this idea of returning to a door that needs to be open, now we get a little bit more insight about what's happening in Revelation chapter 3. This again is these are the words of Jesus written to a church, and the most common way that he employs this kind of imagery is that the master is coming to his own house. The master is coming home to where his servants have been in charge of things. We don't know exactly how it's been going on the other side of the door. That's what the master is there to figure out. And so the picture that we've got in Revelation chapter 3 may be of Jesus waiting outside a door that belongs to him. And he's knocking at the door, and he's waiting for the master's servants. By the way, that's us. He's waiting for those who were on the inside of the door where the knob is. The knob's not on the outside. He's waiting for those on the inside. The Christians, not the unbelievers of the world. He's waiting for the Christians on the inside who wear his name, who may have his name plastered on the front of the church building, who read his book, who seek his will, who strive for his kingdom. He's waiting for the servants, the Christians on the inside of his door to hear his knock and open it up to him. He's got the crown on his head. He's got the power. He's got the authority. He can kick the door in if he wants to. It's his door. He can command that the door be opened to him. It's his door. He's got all power and authority on heaven and on earth. He can do whatever in the world he wants to do. He can force his way in, but he doesn't. Instead, Jesus wants whoever's on the other side of that door. He wants whoever's on the other side of the door to choose to let him in. Because he loves us. And he says, I want to come in and I want to have a meal with you. I want to sit down in a relationship with you around the table. Please let me in. It's not the world. It's not the unbelievers. It's the church that is keeping Jesus on the outside. The church that belongs to Jesus. But it's clearly possible that sometimes we leave him, Jesus, outside of his church. That's what's happening in Revelation chapter 3. There's really no way around that. The church is keeping Jesus outside of his church. And could it happen today? Could he stand at the door of the Main Street Church of Christ and knock? Could he stand at the door of each of our lives and knock? And will we, his servants, let the master in as he returns home? Well, what do? When Jesus knocks, we have choices. We can decide what we're going to do. We can keep him outside. We can interpret Revelation 3 to say, you know what? That's Jesus knocking on the door of an unbeliever's heart, and it's up to them if they let him in or not. But that's not what Jesus is saying in Revelation 3 at all. We can say that's got to be the world because the church has already let him in, and that's got to be something besides. It's got to be the world. Got to be those who are outright rejecting Jesus. But that's not what Revelation 3 tells us at all. Revelation 3 says he knocks at the door. It's the Christians who are on the inside. We can keep him outside, and that is safe. We don't have to change anything. Status quo is good. He doesn't come in and impact anything in our lives, in our congregation, in our faith, anything like that. We can keep him outside. That's an option. Or we can invite him in. And this would be hard. This may be quite uncomfortable for us. It could be embarrassing. Inviting Jesus in, the master's return to what is already his home, his door, his people beyond that door, he's returned. Inviting him in is allowing him to come in and do work, to build his kingdom in our church and in our lives. That's what inviting him in entails. It's welcoming the master back into what is already his and giving an account of what we have done with it, of what we've done with what he's given us, of the time and the talents and the energy and the resources. Have we sat around and said, you know, we look good and everything seems fine and we're rich and it's abundant, we got resources and we're having services and things are good. But he says, I know your works. You think you got it. But could he also say you're poor and wretched and pitiful and blind? And it's the master coming home, and inviting him in is us saying, give us an account of how we've done with what you've given us. C.S. Lewis had some great words on this, kind of lengthy, but I'm going to read it. But I want you to think about it. Lewis said, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house, and at first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on, and you knew those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised about that. But then he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to, you ask? And the explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one that you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers and making courtyards, and you thought you were being made into a decent little cottage. But he is building a palace that he intends to come and live in himself. Laodicea didn't want the difficulty of inviting Jesus in. They were already good enough. Good enough, they thought. And so they didn't want the trouble. They liked their old ways. They didn't want Jesus coming in. They didn't want to open the door and let him come in and straighten things out and straighten things up. Because then they'd have to admit their flaws and their wrongs. And they'd have to uncover their messes. They'd have to deal with letting Jesus get to work in their lives. And they didn't want that. No thanks, they say. And so he stood at the door, not of the world or the unbelievers, but of the church, of the Christians. And he knocked. Would they let him in? I don't know. If we go back to our painting, maybe we see a different picture now. We see a master. If we zoom in on that top, we see a master with a crown who's returning maybe to his own house. And if you look at the bottom, it's a house that hasn't had the door opened in a while. It's overgrown because as Jesus knocked, it seems that they were leaving him outside. They bought into the lies that we're good enough. We can keep doing what we're doing. Status quo looks good, but Jesus is outside, and I guess that's just how things are going to be. Have we bought into the same lies as they did? The lies that we have whatever we need, or we will as long as we get a little more money, whatever else we're hoping for, hoping in. Lies, lies, lies. Do we believe them? The truth is that if we don't have Jesus, then we don't have what we really need. Because if we don't have Jesus, we don't get the transformation. If we don't invite him in, he doesn't come in and bring a new kind of life. If we don't open the door as he knocks, then we don't get him to make the changes that we need to make in our lives and in our congregation. We don't get the way, the real truth, the real life, unless we open the door as Jesus knocks. So do you keep him outside? And for some, that may be, I am, not a Christian yet, and I'm keeping him outside, and for me, that may mean I've kept him at arm's length, and I kind of maybe like the message, and I like what he stood for, but I don't know if I want to give in to following him, and so I may keep him outside of my life. Maybe you bring him in today, and you invite him in, and maybe today you're ready to begin that journey of following Jesus, and you're ready to be baptized into Christ, and you invite him in to life, into your life, and when you invite him in, he makes changes, sometimes small, sometimes sweeping, wholesale changes in life, and maybe putting off the old and putting on the new is what needs to happen in our lives. And you're ready to start that today and becoming a Christian and letting the Master in. Or you could be here today and you're a Christian, but like the Laodiceans, you're not really the hot water that's good for some things. You're not really the cold water that's refreshing. You're just kind of the lukewarm that exists, but it hasn't really been good for anything or anybody. It hasn't been a blessing to people around them. Hasn't brought healing or refreshment to anything or anybody. And so maybe today, Jesus stands at the door and knocks. A Christian's door and knocks. And the Master wants to come in where his servants are and sit and have supper. And spend time and be in fellowship with the people that he loves and that he created. So, as he comes to the door and he knocks, do we keep him outside? Or do we invite him in? As painful, as embarrassing, as uncomfortable as it may be. Do we keep him outside? Or do we invite him in today? If you'll notice in the picture, the knob is not on the outside. The knob is on the inside, and that's where the choice is made. In my life and in your life. The Master stands at the door and knocks. Will you let him in today? As we stand and as we sing.